Hey guys, so today we're reading through the Genesis chapters 25 through 27, and in today's podcast, I'm going to be walking through the three main parts of our reading. The first part being Abraham's death and Rebekah's barrenness, then the second part, the birth and life of Jacob and Esau, and finally, the story of Jacob's ladder, which isn't technically a ladder, but we'll get into that later. Alright, let's begin with the death of Abraham and barrenness of Rebekah. So today's reading begins by telling us that Abraham dies at the age of 175, and that he is buried by both of his sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And they bury him in the very same cave Abraham buried his wife Sarah in. In yesterday's podcast, we discussed the significance to this cave and who all eventually gets buried within it. So for more on that, check out yesterday's video. Anyway, the story continues, and we are told that Rebekah, Isaac's wife, is barren, just like Isaac's mother Sarah was. Both Isaac and his father were faced with the same dilemma of barrenness. However, they both chose different paths on how to handle it. And we all remember how Abraham chose to handle it. Rather than trusting in the Lord's promise, Abraham sought to obtain life apart from God. However, in today's story, we read that Isaac does not follow in his father's footsteps, and we see him bring the matter to the Lord in prayer. God responds to Isaac's prayer by granting Rebekah life, and she becomes pregnant. Now, within this story, two themes reoccur that we've already discussed that I felt were worth re-mentioning. The first theme being life requiring faith. If we are ever going to have true life, it must come through faith and devotion to the Lord, not by our own actions. This is precisely what we see Isaac do that his father didn't. Rather than attempt to obtain life apart from God, like his father Abraham, Isaac takes the matter directly to the Lord, and the Lord blesses him for it. And the second theme that we see reoccur is God choosing the unlikely to fulfill his plans. Once again, we see God using people, in this story Rebekah, who no one would expect him to fulfill his plans. This is a major theme throughout the Bible that I'm sure you are catching on to, and that one that I will continue to point out as we go along in our study this year. So then we are told Rebekah experiences great discomfort during her pregnancy. She feels some sort of struggle within her womb, and she asks the Lord why. The Lord responds by telling her that she is carrying within her womb two nations, and that these two people will be divided. One will be stronger than the other. But then God says something very strange. He says, "The older shall serve the younger." Now, the reason this is strange is because this would have been contrary to the culture and customs at that time. You see, at that time and cultural setting, the older brother never served the younger brother, or brothers. And so we are going to see how this relationship plays out and what kind of tension it causes. But not only would their futures and destinies be different, their physical and mental characteristics also. Esau, which means hairy, was in fact hairy, but beyond that, he was a very hard-working, rugged outdoorsman who spent the majority of his time with his father Isaac. While Jacob, on the other hand, which means deceiver, was not a very hard worker. He was a plain old mama's boy who spent most of his days indoors and spent the majority of his time with his mother Rebekah. Now pay attention to how this family division, Isaac with Esau outdoors and Rebekah with Jacob indoors, develops throughout the story. Because right now it seems harmless, but this division eventually leads to the destruction of the family. So pay attention to this moving on. Anyway, we are then told of a story where Jacob steals the birthright from his brother Esau. So, a little background before we dive into the story. Back at that time, the oldest son received certain privileges. So during his father's lifetime, he took precedence over his other brothers. And once his father died, he would receive a double share of the inheritance that would be left behind. This is important to keep in mind when examining this part of the story. So, in the text, we read that Esau was returning home from the fields after a hard day's work and was desperately hungry. However, Jacob would only serve him if he would sell him his birthright. And so in desperation, Esau gives in and sells Jacob his birthright. This kind of devious behavior would set the tone for the rest of Jacob's life. He would live up to his name as deceiver on many occasions, as we will see. But what I want us to focus on is how this is not Jacob's true identity. This is the false version of who he was truly made to be. Eventually, Jacob lives up to his true identity, and God changes his name. But in the meantime, pay attention to how he deals with people prior to his conversion. Okay, back to the story. We are then told that famine strikes, and Isaac follows in his father's footsteps, and without first seeking the Lord, he flees to a foreign land. But it's a familiar one to us. It's Gerar. Now I want you to recall what happened when Abraham went to Gerar. Remember, he runs into their king Abimelech and tries to pull the old "she's my sister" over him, and it doesn't work out so well. Well, Isaac clearly didn't get the family memo on how that never worked out, and thinks that this time it will be different. And so Isaac tries, and at first it seems as though he succeeds, but then, like his father, it fails. And we are told he gets caught caressing Rebekah, which is essentially another way of saying he was flirting with her. And so King Abimelech put two and two together and comes to the realization that Rebekah is not his sister, but in fact was his wife. This led to a confrontation between the two men, and Isaac winds up confessing to the king that the fear got the better of him and led him to lie. By the way, if you're reading this story and wondering if this was the same King Abimelech as with the story with Abraham, it's not. Many scholars believe this was just a title, like Pharaoh, that was held by many different kings. So it was most likely not the same guy. Anyway, in spite of all of this, God blesses Isaac, we are told, and then we are told he was so blessed that this made the Philistines in the land envious of him. And so they go to the king and tell him that he has to move. And so he does. So then Isaac moves further and further away, and King Abimelech fears he may retaliate against them. So he goes out and makes a peace treaty with him. Okay, back to the story of Jacob and Esau. So we are then told that Esau marries two pagan Hittite women, which broke the command of his grandfather Abraham not to marry any woman outside of their family. But since Esau was his father's favorite, Isaac lets it slide, we are told, and he finds favor with his eldest son. And this stirs up some family drama and makes Sarah and Jacob furious, and so they begin to plot against Isaac and Esau. Pause. Notice the division I mentioned earlier and how it's developing and becoming more defined. On one side, there's Isaac and his favorite son Esau, and on the other, there's Rebekah and her favorite son Jacob. This is not a good recipe for a successful, functional family. And we see a theme being introduced, a theme of favoritism. Favoritism is a huge theme moving forward in the Bible, and we're going to see Jacob later use the theme of favoritism with his sons. But we'll talk more about that later. Anyway, back to the story. One day, when Isaac was very old, we're told, he called for Esau and asks him to kill and prepare some game, and that after he had done this, he promised to bestow the patriarchal blessing upon him. But Rebekah overhears this, tells Jacob, and they make plans to deceive Isaac by dressing up Jacob to pretend to be his brother Esau and steal his blessing. So Jacob gets dressed up, approaches his father, and deceives him. And the reason this deception succeeds is because Isaac relies solely upon his senses. Dr. John Davis, in his book From Paradise to Prison, says, quote, Isaac's dependence upon his five senses resulted in his deception, and this provides a rather subtle warning to all who would depend solely on empirical evidence for truth. Satan has for millennia provided impressive substitutes for the real thing, and unfortunately, many do not discover the deception until tragedy has occurred. End quote. The deception works, and Jacob once again lives up to his false identity as deceiver, and steals the final blessing of his father Isaac from his brother Esau. So this makes Esau super angry to the point of wanting to murder Jacob, which, quite frankly, is no surprise. So Isaac tells Jacob to flee, so does Rebekah, and he does. We are then told of a story of Jacob's dream. Jacob, in his fleeing, falls asleep during his 400-mile journey, and he has this dream about a ladder. According to Tim Mackey, it's not really a ladder, though. It's more of a ramp. It gets called a ladder, but that's not an accurate way of understanding that Hebrew word. A better description is a ramp. And so we're going to be referring to it as a ramp. And so Jacob has this dream about a ramp extending from earth to heaven. And on this ramp, he sees angels descending and ascending from heaven and earth, going to and from. Now, scholars and theologians have many different explanations and interpretations of this dream. However, there's primarily two main views. The first view is based on verses in the book of Hebrews, and it's that the stairway or this ramp symbolized the genuine and uninterrupted fellowship between God in heaven and his people on earth. The angels represent these messengers to reflect God's constant care of his own. Then the second main view that is held is that it is a foreshadowing of Jesus being the ladder or ramp or bridge between God and man. Jesus in John 1:51 references himself as the object in which angels of God are ascending and descending onto, which represents that he is the only way to the Father. Now pause. There's two stories that I want us to pay attention to, and they go together. It's the Tower of Babel and this story right here of Jacob's dream. And here's why they matter and kind of correlate. The Tower of Babel story represents man's inability to reach God. No matter how hard we try, we can't. Sin has separated us from God, and there's no way we can reach him. However, Bethel, the place in which Jacob has this dream, represents God's ability to reach man. And this is later fulfilled through Christ, the only willing and able mediator / bridge between God and man. And he would eventually say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you want to learn more about all of what this story symbolizes, go check out the Bible Project podcast titled Heaven and Earth Part 1. And about midway through, Tim Mackey explains the theme of heaven and earth and how it relates to this story, as well as some other cool things. So go check that out if you have the time. And so then we see Jacob establish tithing to God for the first time in the whole Bible. Remember, it was foreshadowed by Abraham and Melchizedek, but it's being established by Jacob in this story. All right, guys. Well, that's all for today's podcast. Running a little bit long today, but tomorrow we'll be taking a look at Jacob's marriage to Leah and Rachel, his children, and the story of Jacob fleeing Laban. So be looking forward to that, and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.